Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Karolina. I'm assistant professor of German at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the United States. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of the Polish Studies Association, PSA. The PSA is an organization of scholars, publishers, librarians, archivists, and journalists who specialize in the history, culture, art, politics, economics, and society of Poland. We sponsor the online discussion forum Age Poland, an article prize, a book prize, travel subventions, as well as panels at the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, ACES. So if you're not yet a member of the Polish Studies Association, I want to encourage you to join the organization, and I'll drop a hyperlink in the chat later. And if you are going to ACES this year, please come to our co-sponsored panels and also join us at our reception. And ACES is in Philadelphia this year from November 30th to December 3rd. So we hope to see you there. We hope you become members of the organization if you are not yet a member. This event would have not been possible without another institution. And for this, I now hand it over to Jan Muzekamp, who is DAD Associate Professor of History at the University of Pittsburgh. And he's also co-convener of the Polish Studies Association with me this year. So Jan, I'll let you say a few words.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karolina, for all the organization you've put, the work you've put into the organization of this event. So I'd like to invite or welcome all of you to this event on behalf of the University of Pittsburgh, and especially the Department of History and the Center for Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies. And my special thanks go to Magda Zuzha and to Rebecca Dial. Rebecca is here today for setting the event up and for organizing also the public relations part of it. Yeah, and of course, I would also like to thank all of the roundtable participants today who found the time to be here, and especially Anna Müller, who is the author of this fantastic book. I just started reading it this week, and so I'm especially interested in this roundtable. So if you've not done so, it's really worth buying the book, reading it, and after this panel, I think you'll all agree. So I'm very much looking forward to this event, and without further ado, I'm handing it back to Karolina. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Rebecca. Sorry. Oh, yes, thank you, Jan. So before I introduce the panelists, I want to welcome all our Zoom audience all over the world, whether it's afternoon for you or evening or whatever time of day it might be. And I want to invite you to also leave comments and questions in the chat. We'll have we'll open up the floor later on after all the panelists have spoken and discussed the book, but please feel free to drop your comments in the meantime as well. So I now have the honor of introducing our esteemed panelists, and I will do that very briefly. And I know there's a lot more to say about each and every one, but in the interest of time, I will keep it brief. So, and I want to, of course, begin with two people who have made this event possible. First, it's, of course, the author, Dr. Anna Müller, who wrote the book An Ordinary Life, The Journeys, The Journeys of Tonia Lechtman, 1918 to 1996. And it was just published by Ohio University Press a few weeks ago, so it's really fresh off the press. And we will be discussing this book here tonight, of course. And you will hear more about Anna very soon. And I have put a link to the Ohio University Press site where you can also order the book and find out more about the book in the chat. The second person who has brought us all here together tonight is Jadwiga Biskupska. Dr. Biskupska is Associate Professor of History at Sam Houston State University and co-director of the Second World War Research Group, North America. Her book, Survivors, Warsaw Under Nazi Occupation, was published with Cambridge University Press in 2022. It won the Held Prize from the Association for Women in Slavic Studies. And please note that PSA will be co-sponsoring a panel or is planning a panel at the ACES conference this fall. So there will be an opportunity to discuss this book as well. So thank you, Jadwiga, for organizing this amazing panel tonight. Our next panelist is Marci Shore. Dr. Shore is Associate Professor of History at Yale University. She's also a Guggenheim Fellow and a regular visiting fellow at the Institut für Wissenschaften vom Menschen in Vienna. Her research focuses on the intellectual history of 20th and 21st century Central and Eastern Europe. She has many important publications, of which I want to mention only the award-winning Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 1968. And importantly, before joining the faculty at Yale, Dr. Shore taught at Indiana University, where she supervised Anna Müller's doctoral dissertation. It's also nice to note. Our second panelist is Dr. Joanna Sliwa, who is a historian at the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, where she also administers academic programs. Her research focuses on the Holocaust in Poland and Polish Jewish history. She is the author of Jewish Childhood in Krakow, a microhistory of the Holocaust, which came out with Rutgers University Press in 2022. Next up is Dr. Anna Hájková, Associate Professor of Continental European History at the University of Warwick and co-director of the Warwick Center for Global Jewish Studies, a history of, Global Jewish Studies. She's a historian of everyday life, gender and sexuality in the 20th century in Central and Eastern Europe. And she is author of the prize-winning The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt, which came out in 2021. And then we have, next up is Dr. Małgorzata Fidelis, who is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She teaches on modern Europe, Eastern Europe, Poland and the Cold War, women and gender, and the global 60s. Besides many other publications, she is the author of Imagining the World from Behind the Iron Curtain, Youth and the Global 60s in Poland, which came out in 2022 with Oxford University Press. Last but not least, I want to introduce Dr. John Bukowczyk, who is Professor of History at Wayne State University and specializes in American immigration and ethnic history, as well as urban history. He himself has authored many books and articles and received many numerous awards, but today he's here with us as the editor of the Polish and Polish American Studies series from Ohio University Press. Thank you all for coming here today and tonight, and I will now hand it over to the panel, beginning with Dr. Bukowczyk, who will introduce Anna Müller and the series, and then we'll start the discussion. So thank you all and welcome.
Thank you, Karolina, and thank you especially for this kind invitation to this panel today, which I really appreciate. I wanted to say first just a few words about the Ohio University Press Polish and Polish American Studies series. It is now in its 20th year, actually 21st year. We have to date published 19 books. And we have, by arrangement with Ohio University Press, 16 more that we are authorized to publish. So this series, at the rate we're publishing books, is likely to be around long after I'm gone, which is a happy thought, I guess, in some ways. 11 series books have won Best Book Awards from various organizations. Among them are the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Polish American Historical Association, the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences of America, the Coordinating Council for Women in History, and the American Catholic Historical Association. So this is, I would argue, a premier venue for publishing work in these fields. We are currently and always recruiting manuscripts in social sciences and the humanities. And if anyone has a project that they might be interested in talking about, or a book manuscript that they already have and they might be interested in submitting, I would very much welcome a message from you. Just email me at aa2092@wayne.edu. That to spare you the need to spell my last name, although this audience has no problem with that. Most other audiences more so. As noted in the chat and I guess elsewhere, one can visit the Ohio University Press website and see a list of all of the books we published, their covers and descriptions.
Maciek myślę, że wróci po 11, żeby nie zamykać.
And I'd remind you again that there's a discount for purchases using the code word Tonia. Where they got that from, I don't know. Anna Müller is, of course, our honoree today, you could say, and on the spot for this discussion today. She is Associate Professor of History in the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, holder of the Frank and Majeski and Mary Pajeski Endowed Professorship in Polish-American Eastern European Studies, and director of the honors program there. She also serves as an instructor in the Inside Out Prison Exchange program in Michigan. She's a native of Gdańsk, Poland. She earned her MA from the University of Gdańsk and her PhD in history from Indiana University. From 2010 to 2013, she worked for the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk, where she co-curated exhibitions on the Holocaust, concentration camps, forced labor, and eugenics. Her first book on the life of women imprisoned in socialist Poland, If the Walls Could Speak, appeared in 2018 with Oxford University Press. Her second book, which we are discussing today, is An Ordinary Life, The Journeys of Tonia Lechtman, 1918 to 1996. We are in the series extremely pleased and honored that we were able to recruit this project for our publication program. Those of you who've read it already or have just begun reading it realize that she is a very fine writer, and this is a really riveting story with a voice that is extremely compelling. It also deals with topics and themes that should be of interest to people in many fields, more than are simply represented here, I suspect, in this audience today. Women's studies, of course, Jewish studies, World War II studies, and for us at the press, we found this book especially compelling because it dealt with Polish-Jewish relations, which, in my view, is a central topic in contemporary Polish history and Polish affairs, and also with Polish identity. Identity studies are very current in many subfields, and I think that Tonia Lechtman, navigating as she did her Jewish identity and her Polish identity and her communist identity, is an enormously rich case study in these complicated negotiations that need to go out by a person within themselves and also with society around them. So that said, I give you Anna Müller.
Okay, our first panelist to comment will be Professor Marci Shore. Please, of course, a reminder from Karolina to assemble your questions and comments in the chat so we can get to them after the panelists. Professor Shore, the floor is yours. Also, if you are not speaking, could you please remember to mute yourself? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Yaja. Thank you, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to see Anya and have a chance to congratulate her myself. I, of course, am very proud of Anya because she was my student at Indiana. I'm also very proud of Yaja It's one of the great kind of joys of being in this field to see your students do so well and learn so much and have so much to teach the world. We all keep trying to save the world, and the world, despite our best efforts, seems to be resisting this attempt to be saved. But I'm very happy to see all of you and be reminded of just how good these efforts are. And I love this book, and I've loved this project from the beginning. I remember when Anya first wandered across the topic. I remember when she first met Vera Lechtman. I remember reading a bit about Vera in the exhibit at the Polin Museum on the first year opening conference, I think it was. And even a little fragment of Vera's life was already extremely compelling when she is forced to leave in 1968, and she leaves with her mother, Tonia, and her children, and her husband stays behind. She's a young physician at that time. So I followed this project from the beginning, and I am thrilled to see how it's turned out. I will throw out, I mean, I could talk for a long time about this, and I don't want to talk too long, but I will throw out a few topics and observations that I'm hoping the rest of you can pick up on. Some things that I think are particularly perhaps fruitful for discussion. One thing that struck me, like, having read parts of this book and this study at different times over the years, and then reading the whole thing now when it's come out, is that you can tell the whole story of the 20th century through the life of one woman. And, arguably, that is much more effective than other ways of telling the story of the 20th century. I'm biased about this because I also like to write about individuals, but I always think about the famous line by the Polish philosopher Stanisław Jadwiga, who dies at the age of 33 before he has the chance to get his hands dirty. And he writes in his diary in 1911, shortly before his death, "Co nie jest biografia, nie jest w ogóle." What is not biography is not at all. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Like, what we do as historians, and, it is either the story of real people's real lives, or it doesn't really mean anything anyway. And it's good to be reminded of that. And Tonia Lechtman, in an extraordinary way, embodies that. I guess I'll throw out a couple things here. One of which is that biography is a very special form for historians, because it's the only form in which your starting point and your ending point are not arbitrary in some way, or not capricious. Because as we all know, history goes on. Any given moment when you choose to stop, shapes the narrative in a certain way. And as historians, we also have a kind of infinite regression problem. At any given moment, we begin in the past. There's something that happened before that, that is also shaping the story. And so choosing where to begin and where to end, already crafts a narrative arc in a way that is inherently manipulative and cannot be avoided. And there's something about biography that's liberating, because it liberates us from that kind of arbitrariness, because there is an arc of a life. Somebody is born and somebody dies. Arendt likes to talk about natality as a privileged point of access. Birth, both as literal birth, and as the human capacity to set in motion something new. And the birth of each human being, this injection of a dose of radical contingency into the world, is a setting in motion of something new. And everybody's life comes to an end. And so that creates a naturalness to an arc that is a rare liberation from the quality of arbitrariness that pervades our other narratives. The other way in which I think biography is privileged is what it shares with many novels, and that's the fact that our minds are constructed in such a way that You know, a million deaths is an abstraction, and one person's death, you know, and life is real. You know, it's very hard to make an empathetic leap, you know, into an abstract collective. You know, in order to get a reader to make an empathetic leap, we need individual characters. This is what novelists know. You know, they know that 100 lives, 1,000 lives, 10,000 lives become an abstraction for the reader. And if you want the reader to make a connection, there has to be a single life. I don't think that's good or bad. I just think that's what it is. And that's if we want there to be that sense of intimacy and that sense of closeness, you need the granular details that comes from looking at an individual life. I think in some ways, empathy functions best and most intensely at the level of the individual. That while I'm speaking about novels, let me just throw out a plug. There is a fictional story about a woman in the Soviet Union, a kind of epic novel called Plötzlich ist des Abends by Petra Morsbach, that this book reminded me of, that Tonia's life reminded me of in some ways. In English, the title would be And Suddenly It's Evening. I think it's one of the great novels of the 20th century, which for some reason has never been translated into English and for some reason has never been translated to Polish, as far as I know, but it's been recently translated to Ukrainian, which is how I first heard about it, although I read it in German. But in that case, like in biography, you live through the Soviet experience and you live through Stalinism, through the life of one person. What, of course, characterizes the 20th century, you know, Antonia's life in it, is it was a century of what in the Germans like to call Grenzerfahrungen, these kind of border experiences, these limit experiences, you know, these experiences that push us to the boundaries of human existence. Lev Shestov talks about the fact that reason is all fine and good if we're talking about those middle zones of ordinary human life. But when you get to the realm of extremity, reason breaks down. And so how do we grapple with extremity? You know, and we see here now Tonia going through the great ideologies of the 20th century and passing through Zionism and living communism, you know, and experiencing Palestine, experiencing Israel, experiencing the Spanish Civil War, experiencing the Nazi occupation, experiencing the Holocaust, experiencing Stalinism, experiencing all of these things, all of which push one to the edge. You know, one of the things I find revealing about her story that I think is something I try to bring out for students in a more general sense, but I think in order to make it real can only be brought out through the lives of individuals, is the question of determinism versus responsibility, which of course the revisionist Marxists were obsessed with. That is the relationship between individual choice and historical circumstances. And that interpenetration is something I think is only really illuminated through biography. We see here, you know, and Anya brings us out so well, how Tonia is constantly making choices. At every moment in her life, she's making choices, when to leave the kids, when to take the kids, who to leave them with, in dire circumstances, where do you make a compromise, whom do you trust? You know, where do you run to? Which border do you cross? Which border do you not cross? You know, when do you apologize? When do you confess? She's always making choices. Some are radical, some are brave, some seem foolish. And those choices are always made not in a tabula rasa and not in abstraction, but always in a given situation. We're always already in a given situation. That situation is penetrated by historical circumstances and historical conditions. And in that situation, we're making choices. And that interpenetration between individual choice and those structuring historical circumstances, I think, is only really illuminated through stories like this. I'll raise now, I don't want to talk too long, just a couple things that I hope the rest of you will pick up on. I hope Anya will respond to, because she, in particular, because you write about this so beautifully and self-reflectively in the beginning, you know, and that's about the genre of biography and the relationship between the biographer. You know, and Anya writes like very self-reflectively at the beginning of this book about how she came to identify with Tonia. and how that identification and that kind of intimacy is in some ways a kind of organic and necessary part of this process of communing with somebody else's life. And in this case, it was particularly complex because you're writing about a woman who is dead, who you have a very intense relationship with, and you also have relationships with her children. I mean, you've realized the relationship begins with Vera, and then you meet Marcel, and then you meet Marcel's wife, and these are extraordinarily complicated relationships. They're intimate, they're warm, they're also necessarily fraught, because the precondition for empathy is voyeurism. And there's no way to get around that problem. Anya writes about Tonia's closet, as her archives, the letters, her correspondence, the letters that were never meant to have been read by anybody else. And that kind of invasiveness is what is the precondition for making a biography like this possible. There's no way to empathetically penetrate without violating that kind of privacy, and that core moral dilemma, penetrates what we do as historians. It penetrates everything we do as historians, but in the case of a very intimate biography of a woman by a woman like this, is particularly laid bare, that relationship between empathy and voyeurism. What does it mean to read the letters that were never meant to be read by somebody else? What does it mean to try to understand her love affairs, her relationship with her husband, her relationship with her mother, her relationship with her children? And as we necessarily bring our own experiences to bear, I was very empathetically, reading what Anya was saying about to be a mother and to write about a mother and to write about what it means for a mother to leave her children, to have a mother, and to write about somebody who is leaving her mother. We bring all of that to bear, and negotiating that with self-awareness, but without any kind of a protocol. So that question about intimacy, about identification with the subject, about the invasiveness of biography, which is the precondition for empathy and for understanding, I want to raise that question. And then I want to raise one more question at the end, which is in this book, Anya doesn't go into in as much detail as she does when Tonia appears in a different role in her first book, but she does go into, to some extent, her experience in prison, in Stalinist prison and post-war Stalinist prison. Anya's first book kind of keeps you in that prison cell, for all of a few hundred pages, with not only Tonia, but other women who are in this prison cell, and what they do, and what the Stalinist interrogators do to women in this prison cell, and Tonia, like these other women, is tortured in prison. How can we write about torture? How can we talk about torture? How can we make a kind of leap into that realm of torture? How do we write about evil, in a postmodern world? How do we confront things like evil, in a postmodern world that demands often a kind of ethical relativism or a kind of, a kind of academic distance? And there are moments in which we come up against certain limits. There are moments at which we come up against stories and experiences that can never be made okay, and cannot be relativized away. And so given the background of all of these conversations we're having now, which is what is happening in Ukraine, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, and unfortunately thinking about, torture and how we can write about that, how we can speak about that, and how we can write about evil and what it means for historians to confront evil, which can only really emerge, I think, in a real way through the lived experiences of actual concrete people. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marci. Our next panelist is Dr. Joanna Sliwa. Could you unmute?
Yes. It is really an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and a real joy to celebrate Anna and your wonderful, fantastic book, Anya. It's It's a really powerful, powerful story, but I think we all know that by now. And I was just making notes so as not to repeat what Marci said. So my response to Anna's really excellent book comes from the perspective of Holocaust history. And in the book, Anna explains how chaos, uncertainty, and danger defined one Jewish woman's life. And Anna offers this profound, detailed discussion of how Tonia Lechtman navigated these factors in the context of the Holocaust in France. So the story that Anna tells in her book deepens our understanding of Holocaust history. And the strength of doing that lies in the focus on the story of an individual, and that's something that Marci talked about already, about the choices, the decisions, the actions that Tonia took. So in particular, Anna focuses on what foreign Jews and Jewish refugees who are living in France, what they experienced and how they managed to survive. Anna's book highlights specific persecution measures, camps in France, the registration of Jews by French authorities, the imposition of restrictions on Jews' residence, and the deportations of Jews. So in this way, Anna's book engages with really important notions in Holocaust studies, such as responsibility for and complicity in the Holocaust. And here we have the case study of France. But there is more. So Anna drills down on the details to reconstruct modes of survival of Jewish refugees in France. And these included flight to the southern unoccupied part of France, called Vichy France, smuggling across the French-Swiss border, and confinement in Swiss camps. So it's really important what the book does, because it shows us the transnational dimension of the Holocaust and of Jews' efforts to survive. And here I just want to say a few words about smuggling, because when we hear smuggling in the context of the Holocaust, it's usually understood as smuggling food into ghettos. And Anna's discussion contributes to our understanding of smuggling people across borders. Anna notes that Tonia and her children were among the 15,000 Jewish refugees to sneak into Switzerland from France. By investigating the challenges and the realities that Jews faced in their place of refuge, the book connects the formally officially neutral Switzerland to a larger history of the Holocaust. Switzerland doesn't really figure in histories on the Holocaust, or like the narrative, the grand narrative. One of the strengths, many strengths of Anna's book is that it really zooms in on aspects of Holocaust history that are still not part of the general understanding about the many ways in which Jews were oppressed and in which they tried to resist and survive. And to tell this multifaceted story, Anna employs microhistorical lens, which I am very excited about, and it's very interesting when she does that in her book. And it's a valuable way of looking at how ordinary people, such as Tonia Lechtman and her children, and the many other individuals who are described in the book, how they experienced violence, oppression, the war, the Holocaust. And Marci talked about biography and about Anna's discussion of writing, right? A historian writing a biography. And what was very meaningful for me when I was reading Anna's book was that she really takes the reader on a journey along with the historian. So we get a glimpse into how historians work, the documents, the kind of piecing together the different elements to craft a narrative, to understand the chronology, and to understand emotions and what was going on. In the book, we read about a woman who, despite or precisely because of her vulnerable position, really exhibited great determination and exercised agency with all its restrictions that entailed. Another thing that I think was very interesting in this was Anna's analysis of Tonia's letters and how Tonia may have understood her position as a targeted person. So as I was reading the book, at first Tonia seemed to understand that it was her political affiliation and her husband's nationality that caused their persecution, rather than their Jewishness. And this is a valuable observation about how Jews viewed the evolving situation and how that understanding shaped their responses over time. I also want to say something about another thread of the book that I found immensely valuable, and that is about families and social networks during the Holocaust. So we read about a mother and her harrowing decisions to protect her children, often with the help of a net of relationships composed of women. So there's a lot to say about that. And this leads me to another aspect of the book, about the experiences of Jewish children during the Holocaust. So this is a book about Tonia, but it's also a book about her children, were children during the Holocaust, child survivors. We learn about how children understood, how they remembered, recollected, and retold their experiences of displacement, of persecution. So on another related level, this is also a story about how Jewish child survivors, Marcel and Vera, how they were coming to terms with their past and exploring their identities. So this is all that I wanted to say for now, and there's many more that I could say. I have two questions, Anna, for you. One is if you could speak more about the most intriguing or new things that, from your perspective, your book brings to the scholarship on the Holocaust. And another kind of basic question that I have is, how did you come to work on Tonia's story? I'm not sure that I understood this from the book. Like, how did you start this? How did you begin working on her? And maybe this is also a larger question about how women are rediscovered in history. Where do we look for these stories? Thank you.
Thank you, Joasha. Our next panelist is Professor Anna Hájková. Could you please unmute yourself?
Yes, I did. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be included, not only because I'm the only non-Polish historian, but also because I'm a huge fan of Professor Müller, and I think her book is tremendous and it cannot be celebrated enough. And it's great to be part of this amazing lineup. I have 4 or 5 points and one and a half questions. Tonia Lechtman was larger than life, but as Anna Müller shows us, it was also an ordinary life. A woman who did not become famous because she didn't want to be famous, but also, and I think that is the more exciting bit, because she's so symptomatic for many other Jewish communists of her generation. Müller tells us a story of a woman politicized in her teens, willing to suffer for her political beliefs. Indeed, a woman whose entire life is reorganized and not for the better. She has no economic security. She has no social security. She doesn't have cachet. She doesn't have economical well-being due to communism. And it strikes me so much because, like all of you, I teach, and the generations of students in it out worry about one thing and one thing only, and that's their careers and their job security. And at Warwick, which is a little bit more progressive, radical department, we sometimes share a bit of a frustration how different kind of things mobilize us. I mean, maybe kind of the radicals go to London, they don't come to Oxford, but it is very refreshing to read about someone who really didn't take any compromises. Here, Anya's book makes a very important contribution to existing historiography that we all know, but I still want to give a couple of shout outs, like Jeff Schatz, Marci Shore, Catherine Epstein, Josie McLellan, Michal Kopeček, Kate Lebo, and many, many others. So I want to segue to transnationalism. Communism had this great promise in the 30s because it promised transnational solidarity beyond anti-Semitism, but it was also the most radical solution in the 1930s. Anya, you spent a fair bit of time in the 30s and 40s pointing out how very Polish Lechtman was. But she also exists in these very transnational frameworks, say in Paris, the people who help her are German communists. Now she comes to her day parade wearing red and white, but I want to tease you to think a little bit more about the transnationalism, because as I will show in a little bit, some of these biographies we can really only understand with the transnationalism. So what is it that remains of the transnationalism today, especially in light of the crisis of democracy in both two countries that were so important for Lechtman? I mean, I will not even come with France, even though my wife is French and she worries about it every day, but in particular in Poland and Israel. And helpfully, the Israelis are indeed marching on the streets, fighting for the democracies, having signs "We are not Poland," which is not unironic. Next point is on ordinariness. To every famous figure, and I mentioned that I will be talking about the concrete lives that we only understand in the transnational context. For every famous figure, like František Kriegel, who was born in what is today Ukraine, went to study medicine in Prague, fought with the Spanish international brigades, then went to survive the war in China, fighting against the Nazis, and then, of course, made a great career as a part of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, and then in '68 was the one member of the Kidnap Central Committee who voted against, even though he was in Moscow. Or Dora Kleinová-Halorska, who you mentioned and whose son is with us tonight. So for every of these famous communists, we have 10 or even more ordinary communists like Lechtman. And I wonder, what does it tell us? I have a try. I think it tells us about the prevalence of communism in the Jewish and Central European 20th century. Here comes my second ask, namely, what were the Lechtman's political beliefs before 1949? You spent a fair bit of discussion of what did communism mean to Lechtman after she's arrested, and this very cruel moment that those 5 years in prison mean to her, and how she uses communism to make sense out of it. And I thought that Marci's points about torture and what are the ethical responsibilities of writing about these extreme situations for historians are very valid. But I thought reading the book, communism is all around, but what does it mean to Tonia? Maybe it doesn't mean to her so much because she doesn't spend so much time thinking about it. Maybe it does. Either way, it is salient. So I want to invite you, Anya, to consider that a little bit about Lechtman's political life and mind before 49. And finally, not only did Lechtman live in networks and friendships, as you wrote so beautifully in your recent essay for Jacobin, and if you guys haven't read Anya's book, Anya's essay for Jacobin, please do so. It's beautiful and it's also very assignable. But I was so struck, and here I want to give a great shout out to Joanna, how you spoke about how Anya shows us how she researches, but what she also does, she gives credit to the people who helped her along the way. Now, Anya, it's not that you had more people who helped you along the way than we do. Everybody, like all of us, build on work of others, but maybe we just kind of don't think so much, or we don't thank them, or we take it for completely normal, or we will mention it in a podcast, or we will mention it in a footnote. Do you make your conversations and your gratitude to these people part of your text? And I thought it was beautiful and full of feminist solidarity. It also reminded me of how I know you, of somebody who is full of support and help for others. And this is one of the reasons why we are all today here, not only because you are an amazing historian who wrote a fab book, but because we all owe you, and we really are very much inspired by what a beautiful feminist scholarship you are. Jen Evans talked in the last few years about scholarship as kinship, and you do it in a very beautiful feminist way. Thank you.
Thank you, Anka. I'll now make a few remarks and then we'll turn to our last panelist, Małgorzata Fidelis. I'm glad that was a beautiful segue because Joasha questioned how Jewish Tonia is and how Polish. And I'd like to say something a bit about how communist she is, which I think transitions here neatly. So first, thank you, Anya, for this book. I read this book between several books actually on Stalingrad, and it was both a breath of fresh air in its tone and its prose, and it made me think a lot about the Second World War differently. So my last comment will be a question to you about whether you think I've gone off the deep end in terms of using your book as a framework to understand the 20th century. So I wanted to focus on one theme in the book, and the book has many because Tonia Lechtman is essentially brutalized by the experience of the 20th century in a number of ways, and her life is a series of responses to these brutalizations and the way they drive her personal movement and her political change. But following Christopher Browning's idea of ordinariness in Ordinary Men, in this cutting edge book in Holocaust historiography, which raises the idea that maybe it's not ideology that motivates some of the key actors of the 20th century. I think that Tonia is powerfully ordinary in that sense. And my takeaway from the book in terms of her political framing is that if the author had not had Tonia's closet, her letters, she would not have understood Tonia. If you'd seen simply a party card, you wouldn't have understood this woman, you wouldn't have understood her motivations and her behavior. And time and again in the book, you detail that she is not a communist in the conventional sense. She's not driven by ideology, and she's in particular not driven by text. Though there are several actors in her life who are. Her husband, Shoma, obviously is. He's an ideologue in the conventional sense. And they form a striking contrast. And there's a number of moments when this comes up crucially in the narrative. And I think most crucially when he intervenes in a friendship between Tonia and a woman who is called in the book of Yesha. And he actually forbids his wife, though they're physically apart, to continue this friendship with this woman who's enormously important to her because of an ideological matter. So it's quite clear in the book that Tonia Lechtman, that in theory, her communism is a crucial piece of her identity, but in practice, what she is a woman who's deeply shaped by her personal relationships, that her politics are person first, and they might actually be text last. And by this, I don't want to indicate that Tonia was not an intellectual, or she wasn't a thinking woman, or she wasn't a bright woman. She clearly was. Her letters reveal this, lots of her actions reveal this, but she's not an ideologue in the conventional sense. And I've been thinking about this since I read the book, because we're talking about a moment in the 20th century when ideology is vital to how we understand things. And we put people in categories. This person is moderate, this person is on the hard left, this person is on the hard right. And Tonia could easily be placed on the hard left as a communist, but she's not. She is someone who is reacting to personal relationships. She's someone who's reacting to and loving her husband and loving her children through the people she interacts with, many of whom are communists and socialists, but I'll note generally not Polish communists. They're often German-speaking communists. So as I was reading this book, I was thinking about this more and more. And there's a few, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet, I'll quote just a line or two so you have a sense of what I'm talking about here. And early on, when the author introduces this, she writes, Tonia remembered her communist activism through the prism of others rather than through its ideological dimension. The ideology is never first. And as the point Anka made already, she reinvents herself during the war as a communist. What was she before? I wouldn't say not a communist, but as someone who is loyal to others, to those around her. At page 65, you write, as a communist, she opposed marriage, even to a man she loved very dearly. But practicality trumped ideology. And I would say even more than that in Tonia's life, it's not that practicality trumps ideology, it's that people trump everything else. And the more I thought about that, the more I was captured by this idea, because your source base, Anya, allows you to bring this out in a way that's rarely possible, even in a biography, because you have so many facets of her relationship with other people, and particularly other women with whom she shares her feelings, and she discusses the practicalities of her life. But the bigger question I had from this is Tonia unideological in an unusual sense, or should we perhaps be looking back at the history of the 20th century, including its most fraught moments during the Second World War and the building of socialism, and realizing that a lot of the people that we pin down in the documentary record as ideologues might be a bit more like Tonia. They might be person-first actors. So I wanted to check in with you about that question first before I bring it forward into my own scholarship. And the follow-up to that is, if that's true, is it true primarily because she's a woman? Is her gender the central category there? Or is this simply, by and large, how people have behaved, and historians tend to pigeonhole people a bit more narrowly than we should? Okay, so I will turn things over to our last panelist, Professor Małgorzata Fidelis. Could you please unmute yourself?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Congratulations to Anya on writing this amazing book. It is very difficult to be the last speaker on the panel because almost everything I wanted to say has been said. So let me first say that I agree with all the praise for this book that has been expressed by the previous speakers. So the book claims to be about an ordinary life, but neither the life of Tonia nor the book are ordinary. They are remarkable in so many ways. It's a beautiful book. It's deeply personal on so many levels. We have the personal life of Tonia, but also the personal journey of Anya, who is putting together the story and who is telling us how the story is coming together. So, in addition to everything that has been said, let me add one more point and two questions. So the book builds on the best tradition of writing history through the lens of individual biography. It offers a powerful interplay between microhistory and the macro perspective, the larger European and global developments. It reminded me about Nathalie Simone Davis' books. Anya talks about those books as her inspiration in the introduction, but also about Michael Kwa's Contraband. The main character is very different from Tonia. He's a criminal. Maya Jasanov, The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World. So this is really the continuation of this genre. What is significant about Anya's book is that we are dealing here with experiences of an individual who was marginalized in so many ways. As a woman, as a Polish Jew, as a refugee, as a communist. She allows the reader to look at the dark side of the 20th century through those traditionally marginalized perspectives that come together in that one life. So now the questions. My first question is about Anya's research. I was impressed with the amazing research in several different countries. So I am wondering, Anya, if you could talk a little bit about the documents you were working with. It looks like an amazing detective work. How did you put the story together? Can you tell us more about the process? You visited all the places, or maybe almost all of the places that Tonia has been to. What was the role of a place as a historical source in your research? How did you reconstruct the chronology, the journeys? By the way, I loved the maps in the book that show the journeys of Tonia and her husband Sioma. They really demonstrate how transnational many of the lives were during that time. Transnational in a sense of forced displacement, usually. And the second question is about women and communism. This builds on Jadzia's question. You show a perspective on communism as a project of self-understanding, as a way of life, as a way of survival under extreme circumstances. We don't know exactly what Tonia thought about the communist ideology, or the Soviet Union, or Stalin. You say at one point that she was not, it seems like she was not aware of the political events in Poland towards the end of the war. She does not communicate her thoughts about political events. 1968 was also very interesting. The time of the anti-Semitic campaign is almost completely overshadowed by her focus on the family. This is interesting because most of the personal testimonies by communist women are exclusively about political events or political activism. This is what Agnieszka Mrozik talks about in her book. There is no boundary between the personal and the political. For Tonia, it seems it's always personal. I liked how Jadzia expressed this. She defines her communism through the relationships with people. So how does this compare with other personal writings of communist women? What do you find unique in the way Tonia presented herself? And at what point do you think she developed a critical perspective on communism or stopped identifying, if ever, with communism? Did she ever abandon her personal communist identity? We know from that interview in 1996, I believe, that she considered herself complicit in communist crimes, even though she was a victim of communism, a victim of Stalinism. So I guess the question here is, how did she understand herself as a communist later in her life? Thank you.
And now we'll turn things over to our last panelist, who's actually our guest of honor, Professor Anna Müller.
None of this is easy. I have so many questions, and the comments you guys offered are incredible and so rich. There's no way I will be able to answer all of them. But let me start by saying that I am incredibly grateful to you all for taking your time, to everybody that shared their views on the book, to all my students and friends and colleagues that are joining this. This is just incredible for me to see, and I'm a little emotionally shaken. So I don't know how clear I can be in my thinking. So this book was definitely a product of love. I will start there, and it seems like this meeting is also a product of love. Okay, let me just try with some of the questions, and how long do you, Jadzia, want me to speak? Because we should probably open it for questions from the audience as well.
How much time as you want.
Okay, that's okay. That's tricky. Okay, so let me just start with with something that seems to be the easiest, how that journey began, and maybe a little bit about the research, and maybe how I sort of negotiate, what Marci was talking about, the voyeurism and empathy, because this is something that is sort of always on my mind and was particularly salient during writing of this book. And then I'll try to go into the communism and then transnationalism of the story and gender and Tonia's communism. So it began in I think it was 2008, maybe later. I met with Teresa Torańska, who was an incredible Polish journalist. For a very brief meeting, I had only one question for her. I was writing a book on Polish women political prisoners, and I was sort of intrigued by this idea that there could have been communist women in prison in Stalinist prisons, but I could not, during collecting the oral interviews, I was not able to find any indications that they were there, even though I sort of knew intuitively that they were there. And Teresa Torańska just gave me one email address, basically saying, get in touch with Vera Lechtman. So I emailed Vera Lechtman. We had conversations over email. I called her And almost immediately after our first conversation, she sent me this longer interview that was made with her mother in 1996. She also implied that there was a movie made in the 1980s by Marcel Wozinski, who essentially met with Tonia and her friends from prison to record their interactions, their conversations. I emailed Marcel Wozinski almost immediately after that meeting, which must have been, I don't know, 2009 or around 2009, and asked him about the recording. And he told me that this was all this material was destroyed, in the 1980s, and nothing is left. Vera didn't believe him. He told me to keep asking. So every 2 months, I kept asking for, are you sure that everything is destroyed? Maybe there is something left on the shelf. And what's interesting is that eventually he found some material and actually created this wonderful documentary that is titled Tonia and Her Children. I think sort of knowing that there is this incredible family archive in Vera's house, and knowing the story from, because when I was reading my book, once I knew Tonia's name, I was able to look into the interrogation protocols. So I knew that side of her, the time of the imprisonment. I felt, and I think this is maybe partially the answer to Marci's question about how to write a story of interrogations. I knew that I cannot really, I don't know, maybe this was sort of emotionally, I wasn't able to deal with somebody's interrogations without finding out more about that person. I think it's always my problem that when I learn something about a person, it's hard for me to stop, say, okay, I learned this moment in her life and now I can move to something larger. It's always like, who were they before, what happened, how that particular moment transformed who they are. So I just knew that those interrogation protocols left a lot to discover about her from prior to interrogations. And then all of these elements, knowing that there is this huge archive that nobody really has an access to, because in 2010, the family was not ready to share the story. Knowing that there is a movie that is based on, elements of the story that she shared in 1980, knowing that there is this long interview in 1996, I felt that Tonia herself knew that there is a story to tell. And she was trying to share parts of the story throughout her life. And I just decided to embark on that road. Initially, when I told Vera that I am going to write, that I would like to write a book about Tonia, which was probably 2014 or 15, Vera told me that her brother is in control of all the letters, and she's not going to let me look at any of the documents without his permission. And the reason why he didn't want to share it initially was because in the movie, if you ever get to watch this documentary, in the movie, he's portrayed as someone who's not fully understanding his mother's story. He's not fully aware of how his mother's story developed. So after that movie was released, he first was very upset with the entire family and then decided to do some research. So Vera told me Marcel has to agree. I emailed Marcel. Marcel didn't respond, I think, for a year. He was sort of going through the process of actually coming to terms with what that movie told him about the life of his mother and also his own life. And then one day he emailed me and said, okay, fine, you can write this book. And almost immediately we became friends. I gave him a call. He invited me for some family vacation that I joined in Israel, where I met Hanya and Vera and Marcel. And almost immediately got pulled into the family, which is very tricky. It just seems like it always happens to me, and I try to resist that. But this tension between what's empathy, what's voyeurism, how far can we go? It's definitely, it just feels like very intrusive to be asking all these questions, to make them sit and talk about the photos. I don't know how to negotiate it. I think I get lost in those individual stories. I get pulled in by them, and it's hard for me to step outside of it, worrying that act of sort of exiting may actually hurt the people that are sharing the stories with me. So that was a challenge, I think. But because the family was very open, and really I didn't feel like there was any fear, any limitations that they were imposing on me. They just gave me the entire story. They gave me the right to do whatever I needed to do with the story. The only comment I've received so far from the family, Marcel doesn't read English, and that's my biggest regret, that this book is only in English, because I would love for Marcel to read the story. Vera is not in position right now to read the story. She's struggling with Alzheimer. Marcel's wife, Hania, read the story and she enjoyed it very much. And the only one comment she left was that that Tonia, that Marcel loved his mother very much, and maybe that love didn't come through in my book, that I didn't show how much Marcel loved his mother. This was a comment to the first draft, and I think I tried to change that a little bit, but this was all the entire comment they had for the book. As far as the research to Małgorza's question, you know, it was surprisingly easy. It's a COVID story, and I would love to say it was a very difficult process, but it was not. So once I had access to all the materials from Vera and Marcel, and that just meant spending time in their house and looking through the photos. What actually made it also easier is that at some point Marcel donated all the letters to Police Museum in Warsaw, and they were very friendly and let me sort of see what I have, what I had. That all of that happened before COVID, and during COVID, I planned I was in Poland in January 2020, I'm sorry, and I planned a trip to Switzerland, to France. I wanted to see all those places where Tonia was, and I wanted to do research in the archives. I was supposed to leave on Monday. On Friday, a national Polish lockdown was announced, so all my trips were canceled. What I did, I just emailed a couple of archives. I emailed an archive in Switzerland, literally on Monday. On Monday, I emailed them and asked for documents regarding Tonia Lechtman. On Friday, I got 104 documents scanned for free. Actually 144, that everything in their archives that had Tonia's name in it, right? It was incredibly easy. I would recommend anyone to start working on Swiss history because access to the archives is incredibly easy. It was very similar with the French archives. It took a little bit longer. I had a person, again, before I was planning a trip to French archives, I had a couple of students that were helping me there, sort of locate where those documents are. And then I was planning a follow-up trip. Didn't happen. And yet I was able to meet with people online, get whatever I needed online. The process was easy. I wish I could say that it was not, but it was just amazing how everybody was, I always say that Tonia felt like people were there to help her, and that's how I felt too. Like there were so many people helping me through this process in the COVID months of 2020. Transnationalism, Tonia's communism. Yeah, that's a great question. And I in the Jacobin piece, I think I said something that I didn't say in the book, namely that Tonia became communist, but she could have become anyone else, anyone who was sort of involved in any kind of social justice issues. Of course, she didn't define it as social justice, but she was always in today thinking about better tomorrow. It seems that that's sort of the main focus of her letters. Always thinking about better tomorrow for the people around her, and her personal relations were incredibly important. I know about 3 books that she read, actually 2 books that she read, and Rosa Luxemburg, whose photos is still in Tonia's old apartment, she definitely read Brzozowski's book. Oh my gosh, I don't remember the Polish title right now. It's escaping me. If somebody comes back to you anyway. So this was sort of she read Stanisław Brzozowski's Polish books, and then she read something by Lenin on love when she was in Bethlehem in prison, and that's it. We know what Selma was reading. We don't know what she was reading. We don't know really anything about the intellectual influences on her, except that, again, if you think how she became a communist because there were some communists in her school, right? They invited her to go and visit a prison and help people in prison. She learned how to become communist because she was helping people, and that's how she identified communism. Yaja, to your question, whether this is something that maybe should help us to rethink other communists, maybe not. It's a larger question. I think it's a great question, and one that that also Małgorzata asked about how she compares to other communist figures. It's a huge question. I'm not going to answer this, but I will give it a thought, because I thought this is actually a fascinating question. I sort of put her in contrast to all the social activists that she was sort of learning from, right? She met these women in France when they were organizing shelters for the Jewish children. Then she was in contact with them in Germany, in Switzerland, and she was in contact with them in Germany. So she's not really meeting ideologues. She's meeting social workers. They're sort of helping her to understand her own role in the post-Poland world. And I think that's something unique about her, right? That she was never part of any kind of communist any kind of communist party structure, but rather was part of this larger movement of people that were trying to help the Jewish children, the refugees. Yes, Brzozowski's pointing at that. Thank you, Stephen. Exactly. So that could be a difference, but I think there is many more, and I think this is a larger question that sort of is important to reconsider how she compares to other movements. I will definitely give it some more thought, because that's a really good question, and also ties to Yaja's question about maybe we were, because of the richness of this archive, right? We actually have a way to see her as a much more complex. Her letters are very personal, but her post-Second World War letters are also tainted by the sense of that everything is probably censored. And I think she is just on purpose not sharing a lot of her thoughts. She has those discussions, she continues having discussions with Noel Field. She's having discussions with her younger brother Julian, who's a communist, who claims that he has communist leanings as well. So they talk about her when they meet. None of this is being shared in the letters. And at some point later on in her life, when she stops writing to her family in Israel because she's afraid of writing to them directly, one of her friends from the United States actually says she is aware of the fact that most of her letters are being censored. It's possible that affects how much she's willing to share. But it's true that even at the moment when that's sort of very striking, when she's opening the hospital, she returned to Poland in 1946, then she hospitals with the help of American money for a trauma hospital for in Silesia, right? And she's so involved, working with Noel Field, working with administrators from Warsaw. She's so involved. And yet all her letters are about her learning how to cook, and organizing her household, and hanging firanki, the drapes in her kitchen, right? And how the different colors correspond, fit each other. It could be that she's just overwhelmed with everything else going on, and those letters sort of become this space of I leave the larger world outside. Plus her family is probably not that interested in those issues, right? It's also the question of who is she writing to. There's also a question from Joasha about what was the most intriguing piece. For me, it was Switzerland. It was so after I wrote this book, May last year, I actually went to France and Switzerland to visit all the places that where Tonia stayed. And Switzerland is the most surprising place. There are no markers of any of those camps. I will tell you just one story and then I will end. I know I didn't answer most of your questions. I do apologize, transnationalism. So in one place in Switzerland, for example, Ascona, where her children, she was separated by Swiss administration from her children, right? Her children were put in the children's home in Ascona. where they were under care of Lily Volkert. So I'm in Ascona, walking around, going to, City Hall, information, some kind of city information site. Nobody heard of Lily Volkert. Nobody, literally nobody. There's no one site, right? And finally, I was sort of getting irritated. Went to like a local museum and said, "Listen, she was saving Jewish children. Why there's not one mentions in? Nobody knows about her." And their answer was, "Do you realize how many famous people arrived to Ascona? Hemingway arrived here to die. Why should we care about any foreigner?" And she was German, right? "Why should we care about any foreigner coming here? It's a beautiful place. People come here." No interest in that story almost at all. It was that part, I think, the Swiss chapter, because all of this was so new to me. The very fact that they had different, camps, it was all new to me. So I think this is sort of this was the most intriguing part of the book. In transnationalism, Anka, I love how you framed this, and I love the fact that you notice, little details. She is hanging out with German communists, but wearing, white and red clothes, right? I think she's trying. I don't know how to answer this question well. I think she feels like she's part of this larger transnational movement, and yet, she's. So I'm trying to imagine her as being very lonely and sort of lost and not speaking the language. And the German communists in France arrived earlier. They arrived, at the moment when it was possible for them to come for some kind of stability, even get a job. She's not part of that wave. So she is very uprooted. She's very poor. She doesn't speak French. She's trying to find those sort of pockets of people that would give her some kind of comfort. And the German communists are there for her because, she's associated with them through her husband. And yet I think she's being seen as an outsider, partially probably because they see her as, somebody who's from Poland, right? And at this point, Polish Communist Party is already banned. So I think she's trying, but there's so many limitations and so many sort of biases, maybe for lack of a better word, that limit how that international solidarity could have developed there. I will pause here, hoping for questions. Thank you so much for all of you. I have many notes and I feel like there's so much more that should be explored. Probably this is not the forum because it just requires a lot of thinking, but thank you.
Well, thank you so much on behalf of everybody to Anya and also to the panelists for just highlighting some aspects of this fascinating book. And thank you, Anna, for explaining some more the context and the details. And yes, so I would like to open up the floor for questions from the audience. I think we have about 15 minutes. So are there any questions? And if there aren't, I have something ready to go. Okay, well, in that case, maybe I'll start. So I'm coming at this as a literary studies scholar, not as a historian. And I was particularly intrigued by the question that came up already regarding narrative, right? So you have a biography that sets this, natural sort of course for your narrative. But can you highlight some other aspects that were really important for you in creating this narrative? Because of course we kind of have the beginning and the end point, but how did you weave the story in between?
So I think for me, important part of thinking about this book was of course narrative, to put this entire story together. That's what brought me to the story first. But I think also the difficulties with the sources, right? It was always and I'm glad that some people pointed it out, because I really wanted for that book to be very transparent, right? To say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and we may never find out. And this is how she's presenting herself in two different sources, right? Because I was really lucky. This book I think, really benefited from an enormous collection of sources. Not only she was writing letters throughout the entire war and before the war, later on she left, some interviews, but whatever state she was in also followed her closely and was producing a lot of documents about her, right? So especially if you think about the interrogation protocols, right? Going maybe again back to Marci's question, she is presenting a very different version of herself in the interrogation protocols that sort of emerges either from the letters or from the later interviews. And I didn't feel like I was in a position to actually say, this is true, this is not true. I really tried to avoid that, right? This is what we know. This is what possibly pushed her to share that kind of story at that particular moment. She was inventing herself differently in 1947-48 when she is being interrogated by the Minister of Public Security, and she's presenting herself differently as a different person when she's narrating her story, partially thinking about the story that her family will be left with. So I think that's sort of the underlying theme, the sources and how historian waves the stories out of fragmented sources. I keep complaining about how fragmented these sources were, but in the end, I think it's an incredibly rich collection, and I think we would be lucky if we always had that kind of fragmented sources.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Alisa Klotz, please.
Hi. Hi. Congratulations. I'm very excited for you. I feel a little odd asking a question about a book I haven't read yet. It's like being a graduate student here in seminars, like, oh, I haven't actually done the reading yet. But I knew that the book was coming out and I was really excited. And one of the questions that I have been thinking myself, because as I'm also working on a project, I also found an individual who seems fascinating to me, seems to have an archive. And one thing, I was thinking maybe I should write a biography of this, unknown woman. But to me, someone who has been, we're trained as historians to write about arguments. Mm-hmm. And when you tell a life story, you tell a narrative. So I was wondering how you thought about bringing together the argument part and the narrative part, or have you thought about writing this book as a nonfiction? What is the kind of, a popular nonfiction story to be sold at Barnes and Nobles rather than an academic book?
Yeah, that would be fun. This was supposed to be a small book. This was just supposed to be, I have those archives, I have this story, why not write about this and sort of not think about all these, academic requirements and argument, right? Why do we need an argument? I'm not going to go there. But this was literally, that's how I thought about this. When I talked to John about this years ago, he asked me, do you have any project that you're working on? And I said, well, I have this story of this woman that, is nobody knows about her. Although I have to tell you, share an anecdote. So I spoke with a good friend of mine, Michael Fowler, some of you may know, over this weekend, and she actually shared this book with her undergraduate students. And, they read about Wanda Wasilewska and all the other Polish communists, and then Tonia Lechtman. And then she told me that some of her graduate students, some undergraduate students went through another class on Eastern European history and essentially told the other instructor that Tonia Lechtman is this well-known Polish communist, right? So Tonia Lechtman is, in some places among some students already considered an important communist. But to answer your question, I felt I wanted to be liberated from that kind of thinking, right? I just had a story and I felt urged to actually share that story. And what I was particularly, it was a very personal project in that sense, because I was just interested in that story. I wanted to see what exactly happened, how her life unraveled, what was in these letters. And I think it was the voyeurism that was driving me throughout the process. And I just wanted to know more. And I really didn't think about how is that going to fit sort of the academic world. And I'm very grateful that John sort of thought that there's a potential in this book to actually fit academic world, because honestly, I think there's a lot of context that enriches, historical context that enriches the story, and is probably more than just a story of an ordinary woman. Although I tried to pitch it to one Polish publisher, and they told me that this book is too historical, that it's, you know, it cannot be a popular book because it's too historical. So yeah, also, I don't know if that answers the questions. But the argument that I'm trying to make there is, you know, about our role as historians, who we are, what role we play in reconstructing those stories, right? But also, you know, about the values of ordinary lives in telling us something about the 20th century that we seem to know.
I have another question in the chat this time. It's from Maria Kapayeva. At which point in your work on this book did you decide to include your own story and start to see parallels you included in the book? How did it feel for you to bring yourself in? And also massive congratulations with it.
Thank you, Maria. I mean, at what point, when I was writing introduction, this is the peak of the COVID, right? You sit in, you know, by yourself in a room. I was actually in Poland. My family was in the United States. My mother flew to the United States so I can have a productive Fulbright year in Poland. None of this happened. So it just felt like a right moment to do it. There's not that much me in this book. I think I am in this book as a historian throughout the book, but I mentioned my personal life in the introduction, especially since a lot of people started calling me Tonia, and it was, you know, it was kind of revealing that, you know, that I am becoming Tonia to them, asking those questions, those very intimate questions. And then I realized that there are certain parallels between us. And most recently, I have to say that I shared that book with some of my students on the inside, incarcerated students. And one of them had a very powerful comment, basically saying that the similarities between her and I seem to be in the fact that we are both very close home, but very far from home. And I thought this was exactly it, sort of this sense of, you know, I'm so far from home, but at the same time, I'm not quite sure where home is. And I'm sort of trying to reconstruct home wherever I am. And I think this was also something that was attracting me to that story, right? I just wanted to be very transparent and sincere with what drew me to her story, really. It was this personal connection that I felt with the archive, with, you know, romanticizing the archives, romanticizing what I can find there. But then on a personal level, there seemed to be something as well.
Okay, thank you. And I think we could have time for one more question, if there is any question or comment from the audience or from the other panelists. I saw a hand briefly, but I lost it. Oh, Kathleen Wroblewski, please.
Hi, thanks, Anya. This is great. So my question for you is, you know, a lot of folks are talking about how your book reminds them of different kinds of work, Natalie Zeman Davis. For me, this book really reminds me of Linda Colley's work, and thinking through how we can imagine the world through the story of an individual. And I guess I would like to hear a little bit more, both about, you know, press you a little bit more on the transnational or global or world historical dimension of this, whether you see this as providing some other way of thinking through communism as a global phenomenon, either through embodiment and maybe not ideology, but to flesh that out a little bit more. And I would also like to hear about, you know, even though you have this rich archive, it's still a historical project, and that means selection. So were there things that you weren't able to access? Or were there aspects of Lechtman's story that you weren't able to delve into? Or was there stuff that you just weren't able to deal with that you wish you had an opportunity?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So communism as a global project. so I think, so, I mean, I hesitated to call it a communist connection, but the network of people, mostly women, but not only, that helped her was very much of people who are driven by some kind of leftist ideals, right? So they were, you know, social workers that sort of emphasize human dignity, the space to always change yourself, the woman from Switzerland, mostly German. She keep coming into contact with those people, and I think they were these women, and that's how I think her own circle was growing, I mean, the network that she was part of, and that's something that also pushed her to social activism after the war. Is it communism, or does it let us to rethink what global communism is? Maybe. I think that's part of what I wish I had a chance to explore further. And I think there is a way to explore further sort of those connections to grow this network that she was part of, you know, through the women that she met in France and Switzerland. I didn't do it partially because it just felt like it's much larger than this book. But, you know, the one consequence of this project is my interest right now in the woman, the Polish Jewish woman that went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, right? And that invites also the question of, you know, internationalism, sort of this global communism, the networks that sort of go beyond our traditional understanding of communism through ideology. So I'm trying to explore some of these questions further in my next research project. There's a problem with archival documents because they are very dry, right? They sort of give us an image of a person as, you know, a party member, not as a human. But those questions, I think, communism beyond ideology, those networks of solidarity, right, are definitely the primary drive for my next research project. I don't have much yet to say, except that there's definitely something there, right? Just from seeing how she moved through all these countries with the help of who were these women, where they are coming from, what kind of backgrounds that they had. Again, communism is just a term, right, that we use to identify them, but it's not communism the way we understand communism. A lot of this is just, you know, this attention to highlighting human dignity, humanity, a right to change, a right to grow, right? Yeah, so Kate, I will come back to this. What I wasn't able to, yes, there was a lot of moments when I was not able to find answers. And there were some questions that were sort of larger questions, you know, of exactly that, this transnational global connections and the meaning of communism. But many of the questions I wasn't able to answer, I was okay with, right? Basically saying this is how only the historians can go only so far. And it's okay now to find answers to some of the questions. And this was, I think I found peace in saying that to myself, right? As a historian, we can only do so much. We can say, this is where the sources take us. And I take it from my favorite, you know, academic advisor, Marci, who says, we only go as far as our sources take us. And I keep telling this to my students. And I actually use that phrase in my own head many, many times. And this was enough for me. I didn't have any burning questions. Of course, there were like burning questions of, did she fall in love again, right? Was her, you know, all the relationships that she built after her husband died, were they meaningful, right? But this was sort of more personal questions that I was not really going to discuss in the book. Maybe showing that, you know, me and Tonia, we're a little bit too close. We formed this very, very close relationship that was perhaps a little bit too intimate.
Thank you very much, Anya, for highlighting more of your book. I think those of us who haven't read it yet are looking forward to reading it. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight.
Thank you so much.
Jadwiga again for putting this together and for organizing everything. And to all the panelists, thank you. And yes, to Anya, thank you for writing this amazing book. And we look forward to reading more from you in the future. And thank you again to the University of Pittsburgh and to Reese for hosting us here in this shared transnational space tonight. So, thank you.
Thank you all. It was really wonderful to see you all. Thank you.
I hope everybody has a good night and a good day.